Good evening. My name is Alexander Hagan. I am the CEO of a small, medium-sized business in Silicon Valley. Previously, I was a financial analyst and a financial journalist and a research engineer, telecommunications, and prior to that, I was involved in international travel as a very young man. And I have always choked up when trying to describe to people the next system, how we can really move past these antiquated systems that we have and really take advantage of all that humans have learned in the last couple of 100 years. And to ground this, you can have an intellectual grounding, like you believe that people that try the hardest should be rewarded the most, a meritocratic view, or a justice-based view, which is that people that are born in impoverished circumstances should have the opportunity to compete with people that are born in fortunate circumstances. So you can have different philosophies, different intellectual approaches, but the first question, other than all the information from the social sciences and economics and religion, philosophy, and current political discourse, is appreciation of the world. And this is so hard for people that aren't connected to ancient cultures and haven't traveled much, because as you travel around the world, you discover that there are hundreds and thousands of ancient peoples with customs and costumes and architecture and habits. And the people that are most rooted in the old ways are often, for me, the most enriching people to encounter. Although not always, obviously. I mean, modern people can be interesting too. And then, how can people live together? So we currently live under modern sort of super capitalism, where we have these bourgeois parliamentary democracies that are controlled by powerful economic players to tightly control what's allowed in public discourse, including shaping the media narrative, which is controlled by private corporations. And the slant of the private corporations has ended up mutating and distorting the NPR, National Public Radio, which has also become much more following the Washington narrative or the Washington consensus and things. And I noticed early on when they started covering all of these military activities, becoming much more military oriented. And of course, we can hear from their sponsors that it's the whole military industrial complex that underwrites their programs. So if you study human civilization, it doesn't just go back to Babylonia or Egypt. There's many, many ancient civilizations, and they've lived in many different ways. Humans can live in remarkably different types of social situations. So we have societies that are largely equal, such as what's called Old Europe that Maria Gimbutas described, or the ancient Dravidian or black civilization of India, the Indus Valley civilization, which is actually a mixture of the very dark native Indians, which were later treated as untouchables by the new ruling class that emerged over India and overthrew this country that was largely black in population. And there's model figures made of cast in bronze from around 2000 or 1500 BC showing the beautiful dancing girl wearing bangles much the same way people do to this day in this area. So there's an unbroken tradition of 3,500 years. And that's what climate change threatens, is that if you don't have the same foods that you can grow in the same area in the same weather, all of those traditions simply become faint echoes. And after a few generations, they're stilled because it's no longer relevant to people. Poetry about the call of a bird that's no longer there, or a type of weather that is no longer relevant. Now, of course, in fact, in the case of the Indus Valley Civilization, so this was partly formed from ancient peoples of the Near East, the so-called uh, Iranian agriculturalists and hunter-gatherers, who may very well be not that distantly related to some of the early peoples that populated Europe, the Neolithic farmers that came into Europe. But there were all kinds of different people that stemmed out of the Middle East because we all come from Africa in 70,000 BC. There was a time when the people in Europe were dark skinned compared to modern Europeans, and very little of their DNA is left in modern Europeans. The first wave of the people there. So there, there were what are now the ancestors of modern Europeans living in the Middle East in, say, 25,000 BC, certainly. Um, so this Indus Valley civilization was pushed out by the eastern side of the ancient Germanic legend, the Indo-European or Aryan cultures, which lived in southern Russia and what's now the Ukraine, and also what's now Kazakhstan. And the eastern branch spread into India, and the western branch overtook and destroyed the old, more peaceful, more equality amongst the sexes, the old Europe, which I was talking about before. And this old Europe has the signs of writing thousands of years before what we call the first writing. And this is no conspiracy theory. It clearly is a early form of writing, which comes from the Turdas tablets, if you want to look it up, Turdas, going back to 5000 BC. And this follows into, I think, what's called Eteocretan, these symbols. And the last of these old European civilizations to fall were the Minoans of Crete, and the Cretans, I'm sorry, and the people of Cyprus, the Cypriots. Those were the last two places to fall. They were on islands, and the wave of invasion came from southern Russia into Eastern Europe and then fell down into the Mediterranean into Greece. So that's our clearest link, and we know from the Minoan society what looks like was a really lovely civilization where women were very highly valued as queens and goddess priestesses, and men as well, and with bull fighting where people leapt over the bull as acrobats. And there's also a telltale sign of this old society is finding societies where people leapt over bulls. So in the first case, we have a deep appreciation for how beautiful all the different expressions of humanity are, and how can we cultivate that in people. And I think it's there instinctively, but this, and I'm hoping things like the internet can show people more of these old folk customs, and not just the latest Kim Kardashian video. But really, it would be nice if every young person could, maybe walk around the world, if we're worried about carbon footprint, once in their life, and see what is at stake for all of us in all these beautiful places, beautiful architecture, interesting languages and customs. And, the U.S. Washington attitude has been one of incredible callousness and insensitivity. And my libertarian Republican brothers may think, I'm being, too, touchy-feely here. But, I was fortunate that my dad he was the first in his family to get a college degree, and he went on to study in Poland, and so I lived there when I was 5. So I got to see a completely different country. Then I came back to South Chicago and saw this very harsh, poor neighborhood here compared to a peaceful, what's appeared relatively, not exactly prosperous, but people had things to eat and drink and played and had fun and had a good, elementary school. So I had that opportunity, and I became interested in an early age in all the frontier lands. And so that gets to the space of frontier. So part of having a great next system is imagination and inspirations to draw upon. One inspiration, all the different ways we've lived together. And there have been many forms of democracy in human history, and Aristotle writes about them. And there are many forms of kind of semi-utopian experiments like Amana and Oneida, which are very successful, intentional communities that everybody got very rich off of at the end. So there are many ways to shape and form human societies besides simply the survival of the fittest. So we have the value of the cultures, the knowledge of all the different ways of living. That brings us to our third inspiration. And our third inspiration is nature, natural systems, and then talking about the frontier, what frontiers are left for people that are awed by discovery. And obviously, we have inner space and outer space. We have the world outside of the Earth to discover, and all of the complexity at the computers and in atomic and subatomic and quantum processes. So the microcosm and the macrocosm are still frontiers for us. So we can draw inspiration from that. But most importantly, to draw inspiration and value nature. And how do we gather around such ideas? So what does the next system look like? And how do we get there? So in my view, we need a modern digital framework for governance. And we should give up on the secret ballot in the initial discussions. Perhaps someday we will have a form of security that guarantees that. But for the time being, the only that is private is the large surveillance systems, what's going on in their background. We don't know about them. They know everything about us. If you think your vote is private, do you express any political sentiments in any of your emails? Do you express any political sentiments in any of your social media? Okay, do you ever talk about it on the telephone? These systems are all instrumented, monitored, collected to varying degrees and varying frequencies. So actually, the powers that be know quite well exactly who supports which candidates. It's almost unnecessary to go through the formality of an election because people show so many clues of what they... So who doesn't know who you support as presidential candidate? You don't know whether your voice is actually ever heard. So for people on the left who are involved in the Bernie campaign, we have seen troubling forms of disenfranchisement in voting, which has reduced our actual count, the amount of the public that supports this movement, which is certainly 30% of the public, let's say, it doesn't reflect in the actual counted votes, and this is because of, for example, people who can't vote because they had a felony, and because people who don't have a valid ID, people who can't get time off of work to vote because the laws about time off to work don't automatically guarantee that people won't be in an unhostile atmosphere, and there's also broken voting machines. There are concerns the voting machines, all made by Republicans with secret code, is totally unauditable and unverifiable. And there are different standards all over the U.S. There's no serious money been put into this. All this talk about Russia interference, and the real problem is the elections themselves could easily be tampered with. So the first principle is we could have a framework of government where you represent your political power, that is, you vote, at a local level for your city council, your mayor, at a regional level. Right now we have counties, but maybe we want to rethink regional levels. So here in the Bay Area, that's a region, clearly. There's the Sacramento area, there's the Monterey area. Each of those are regions, and you could delegate your political power, that is, vote for people, at that level. And then there's a level above that, the third region, that might be the state level, then the federal level, then the continental or hemispheric level, and then the international level. Why can't we have a single basic framework which is adaptable to each community? Because there's two elements of governance. One is basic kind of constitutional law, and the other is more about organization of the public sector to provide services. And to my opinion, that needs to be set up as a set of utility cooperatives. That way, it can behave in the best ways of a cooperative or a government structure or a private structure. So it's a more flexible creature. It can be technically a governmental structure or it can be a shareholder structure. And we can look back to intentional communities like Amana, Oneida, and also colonialism is a terrible scourge on indigenous people worldwide, but it's interesting how their charters are set up for some colonial projects. So if you imagine refounding a town without exterminating local population, you can look at things like Plymouth for these charters where people get shares in the community proceeds. So if you have this basic digital framework for voting, you can then delegate your vote depending on the area. So let's say you have a climate scientist that you trust utterly. You could simply delegate your political power to that scientist at either the federal or the international level. Now, a system like this could enwrap the world in a few months. And then the entire old governance structures could be declared obsolete. So the citizens could seize power in a matter of months with a good digital platform and some engagement. Now, there's hundreds of hours of thought in each part of this. So, for example, when we talk about outmoding the old government system, which I consider antiquated, which is we have the feature now with digital. You could basically, digital communications, you basically keep a list of everyone in the world on a regular home computer of who they delegated their political power to, that is voted for, at the county, state, federal level. That number of records, which might be 60 billion records, could be kept in a home database. And that means on a daily basis, you could change your delegation, that is, who you voted for. So voting wouldn't happen anymore. You would have a delegation of your political voice to people at different levels, and you could change it at will. Now, of course, everyone could customize these things to create more stability in their systems. But let's look at the feature that humans can get rid of this concept of elections and have a concept of ongoing governance. Now, and you can build in old familiar steps, but the advantage of this is that the constant advocacy people are undertaking doesn't have to wait 4 years before it can feel it has its voice. So from taking these three inspirations of all these beautiful human cultures all over the world, which I've been fortunate enough to have learned a lot about as a kid, just reading and daydreaming and then actually seeing for real, because was my number one priority in life, was to be able to go and see interesting old cultures and civilizations around the world. So we take that inspiration, we take the inspiration that there are many different ways. And so what I advocate is that there's a funny Bernie imitator who had an interview with Bernie, so sort of Bernie interviewing Bernie, and he said, isn't the reason that you're doing this secretly to cosplay being a green FDR? And so it made me think about this, which is I think each area should become more and more unique and not more and more like McDonald's or whatever this global homogenization is going on. How do we do that in this interconnected world? But each area should develop its own uniqueness, its own regional flavor, potentially its own regional dialect. And the local people should own the land and minerals in common in their region. And it shouldn't be absentee landlord owned. The buildings in their best towns shouldn't be owned by people who don't live in the community. And the minerals under the sea and the frequencies in their airwaves should not be owned by people outside of the community. This greatly reduces inequality and increases accountability. If you try to limit structures to the size of any one of these communities, Bay Area, LA, as large-sized versions of those, which they're nearly countries in and of themselves, but nonetheless, they're small bioregions. And then, my proposal is taxation right now functions to do two things, many things, but one way of looking at it is a redistribution, that is helping the poor. And the other is obtaining needful services through sort of collective process. So having a national social security is more secure than if you tried to arrange all that on your own in the private sector. So you pay some of your taxes hoping you're going to get a road, a social security, some direct benefit. And the other part you realize is to support others less fortunate than yourselves. Now, one way in this sort of next world I'm describing, made up of city states, where people have a kind of election system that can work for the whole framework, and that initially I proposed we disband anonymity because then we can plug in anonymity once we are absolutely 100% certain it doesn't impede people's ability to express their view. Because, as I said, the problem is the only thing secret about your vote right now is whether it counted. And the people know your opinions already with the kind of mass surveillance we have, and they know a lot more than that. Everything you do on your phone and your computer, everything you do near somebody else's phone, can be in some way inferred and made into a profile about you by corporations who share it with the intelligence agencies. So when I look at all the different societies that I've learned about and who was happy and who wasn't, there are benefits to the medieval time. In the medieval time, son inherited the same craft as his father. There was a concept of, in Europe, in Islam, they had their own noble concepts, quite so, but in Europe there's a concept of Christendom and chivalry. So if you launched a war without essentially papal approval, you could be excommunicated, which meant your followers could go to hell if they didn't overthrow you. So it created a break on certain wars. There were lots of, the papacy was obviously clearly highly politically influenceable. So a lot of people were able to get away with declaring wars without getting excommunicated by basically negotiating with them. So you had the concept of this combined shared Christendom, and where people weren't supposed to invade others without a casus belli, a just cause. And you had the concept of chivalry, where the knight had a Christ-like aspect to them, and was expected to, risk their lives if they saw the poor being abused. The more fanciful aspects of knighthood and so forth. So in H.G. Wells' The Time Machine, the time travelers were transported to a future where this sort of slave society lived under the earth, providing all the needs for the masters living on the surface, who lived a life of complete luxury. And this is what our future is. And we can have that underlayer be ourselves working a very small number of hours a week, tending some basic utility systems for our communities. Or we can be those slaves. They're two different worlds. So we can eliminate work and run it under the hood and in the back